The Windsor Hotel's grand ballroom sparkled with golden light from 3 massive crystal chandeliers, each one worth more than most people's cars. My parents had spared no expense for their 30th anniversary celebration, transforming the elegant space into something that belonged in a fairy tale. White roses cascaded from every table centerpiece, and soft piano music drifted through conversations peppered with the kind of laughter that only comes from people who've never worried about money. I sat at the family table near the front of the room, positioned perfectly to observe the 50 guests my parents had invited to witness their milestone celebration. The guest list read like a who's who of the city's elite, successful business owners, prominent doctors, influential lawyers, and old money families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. My mother, Catherine Williams, looked radiant in her custom-designed champagne silk gown, her silver hair swept into an elegant updo that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. At 52, she still commanded attention when she entered a room, and tonight was no exception. She moved between tables like a gracious hostess, accepting congratulations and compliments with the practiced ease of someone born into privilege. Dad stood beside her in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his distinguished gray beard neatly trimmed and his smile genuine as he shook hands and embraced old friends. Michael Williams had built his insurance empire from a small family business into one of the most respected firms in the state, and his success was evident in everything from his custom cufflinks to the way other wealthy men sought his advice. My older sister Amanda sat to my right, resplendent in a navy blue designer dress that hugged her figure perfectly. At 32, she had inherited Mom's classic beauty and Dad's business acumen, running the family's charitable foundation with the kind of efficiency that earned her features in lifestyle magazines. Her husband David, a prominent cardiac surgeon, looked every bit the part of successful son-in-law in his immaculate tuxedo. Then there was me, sitting quietly in my simple black cocktail dress, watching the celebration unfold around me like a movie I wasn't really part of. At 29, I was the family mystery, the daughter who'd somehow failed to live up to the Williams legacy of achievement and social prominence. "Sarah, darling," Mrs. Hartford from the country club leaned over from the adjacent table, her diamond necklace catching the light as she moved. "Your parents must be so proud to have both their daughters here tonight. Amanda was just telling me about the foundation's latest fundraiser. Such important work." I smiled politely and nodded, used to being the afterthought in these conversations. "It's a beautiful celebration," I replied, taking a sip of my champagne, Dom Perignon, naturally, because Mom never settled for anything less than the best. "And what are you up to these days, dear?" Mrs. Hartford continued, her tone carrying that particular mix of curiosity and condescension that wealthy older women had perfected. "Still working in, was it property management?" Before I could answer, Mom appeared at our table, her smile bright and gracious for the guests but carrying a subtle edge when her eyes met mine. "Sarah's still finding her way," she said smoothly, her voice pitched to carry just far enough. "Not everyone discovers their calling as early as Amanda did." The comment stung, but I kept my expression neutral. This was Mom's night, and I wouldn't create a scene no matter how frustrated I felt with her constant comparisons. As the evening progressed, the speeches began. Uncle Robert raised his glass to toast 30 years of love, partnership, and building something beautiful together. Family friends shared stories of vacations and business successes, of watching Amanda and me grow up in the Williams family tradition of excellence. Finally, Mom stood to address the room, her champagne flute catching the light as she prepared to speak. The room fell silent except for the soft tinkling of glasses being set down on tables. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice carrying easily across the ballroom. 30 years ago, Michael and I promised to build a life together, and looking around this room, seeing all the people we love, I think we've succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. Applause rippled through the gathering, and Dad beamed at her with genuine affection. "We've been blessed with 2 daughters," Mom continued, her gaze moving to Amanda with obvious pride. "Amanda has exceeded every expectation we could have had. She's building something meaningful with the foundation, she's married to a wonderful man, and she represents everything we hope to instill in our children about service, achievement, and social responsibility." More applause, and Amanda blushed prettily while David squeezed her hand. Then Mom's eyes found me, and I felt the familiar weight of her disappointment. "And Sarah?" "Well, Sarah's still finding her path. At 29, she's still renting an apartment, still working in property management, still figuring out what she wants to be when she grows up. The words hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar, visible, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. I could feel 50 pairs of eyes turning toward me, some sympathetic, others curious, a few probably grateful that their own family disappointments weren't being aired quite so publicly. "Sarah's our biggest disappointment," Mom continued, her smile never wavering even as the words cut deep. "We keep hoping she'll find something meaningful to do with her life, but I suppose not everyone can be a high achiever. We love her anyway, of course, but honestly, still renting at 29? In this economy? It's embarrassing." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, the distant sound of traffic outside, the soft whisper of expensive fabric as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Amanda reached over and squeezed my hand, her expression apologetic, but she didn't contradict Mom's assessment. That's when my phone rang. The sound cut through the silence like a knife, and I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment as every eye in the room focused on me. I started to decline the call, but then I saw the name on the screen. James Morrison, my property manager. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, starting to stand. "I should take this outside." No, Mom said, her voice carrying a note of frustration. "By all means, take your work call. Let's all see what's so important that it can't wait until after your parents' anniversary dinner." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, and I realized this was another test, another opportunity for her to prove her point about my lack of professionalism and social awareness. I looked at my phone, then at the expectant faces around me, and made a decision that would change everything. "Actually, you're right," I said, answering the call and immediately putting it on speaker. "Hello, James." "Ms. Williams." James's voice boomed through the ballroom sound system, professional and urgent. "I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted to update you on the Anderson family situation. The eviction is complete. They're out of the Riverside property as of 6 p.m. tonight." The room went dead silent. 50 of the city's most prominent citizens stared at my phone as if it were a bomb that might explode at any moment. "Which property is that again?" I asked calmly, though my heart was racing. "The Riverside Luxury Apartments, ma'am. Building 4, the penthouse unit. The family owed $47,000 in back rent and refused the payment plan we offered. Legal served the papers this morning and they were removed this evening. Very messy situation. They seemed shocked that we were actually following through." I could see Mom's face going pale as the implications began to sink in. Riverside Luxury Apartments was where my parents lived, in the penthouse unit that James had just mentioned. "James," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned ballroom, "remind me of the full name on that lease agreement." "Michael and Catherine Williams, ma'am. Should I proceed with listing the unit for new tenants, or do you want to handle this personally given your relationship with them?" The champagne flute slipped from Mom's hand, shattering against the marble floor with a sound like gunshots. Dad's face had gone from confident to confused to horrified in the span of 30 seconds. "Actually, James, let me call you back in a few minutes," I said, ending the call and slipping my phone back into my purse. "I'm at a family dinner right now." The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. I could hear someone's sharp intake of breath, the rustle of expensive fabric, the distant sound of the hotel's air conditioning system. "Sarah," Dad said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was that about?" I stood up slowly, smoothing down my simple black dress, the same dress Mom had criticized earlier for being off the rack and inappropriate for such an elegant event. "That was my property manager, Dad. James Morrison. He manages my real estate portfolio, which includes about 40 properties across the city. The Riverside Luxury Apartments complex is one of my smaller holdings, only 200 units. Amanda's mouth fell open. "You own Riverside?" "I own several apartment complexes, Amanda. Riverside, Brookstone Manor, the Waterfront Towers, and about 15 smaller buildings. I've been building my real estate empire for the past 8 years, starting with a small duplex I bought with my savings and gradually expanding." Mom found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak. But you're a renter. You live in that tiny apartment downtown." I smiled, the expression genuine for the first time all evening. "I live in the penthouse of my own building downtown, Mom. The building I bought 3 years ago for $12 million. I keep my living space modest because I prefer to reinvest my profits rather than flaunt my wealth. Mrs. Hartford leaned forward, her earlier condescension replaced by fascination. How much is your portfolio worth, dear? Conservatively, about $85 million. Though my accountant thinks we'll hit $100 million by the end of next year if the current market trends continue. The number hung in the air like a revelation. $85 million. More money than most of the people in this room would see in their lifetimes, and I'd earned every penny of it while they assumed I was a failure. But we live at Riverside, Dad said, still struggling to process what he'd heard. We've lived there for 12 years. I know, I replied gently. I bought the building 5 years ago from the previous owner when he was facing bankruptcy. You became my tenants without realizing it because I kept the management company's name the same to avoid disrupting existing residents. And the eviction? Mom asked, her voice small and frightened. I pulled out my phone and showed them the screen, a detailed accounting spreadsheet that James had sent me earlier. According to my records, you're $47,000 behind on rent. You stopped paying 6 months ago, right around the time Dad's insurance company started having financial troubles. The truth was finally coming out. Dad's business hadn't been doing as well as he'd been pretending, and they'd been living off credit and unpaid bills to maintain their lifestyle. I offered you a payment plan through James, I continued. Reduced rent, extended deadlines, even the option to work out a settlement. But you ignored every communication because you thought it was coming from some faceless property management company that you could intimidate or dismiss. Amanda looked stricken. Sarah, we didn't know. If we'd known you owned the building, you would have what? I asked, genuinely curious. Treated me with respect? Acknowledged my success? Or would you have assumed I was lying, the way you've dismissed everything I've accomplished for the past 8 years? The room was still silent, 50 guests bearing witness to the most dramatic family revelation any of them had probably ever seen. I could see phones being discreetly pulled out as people realized they were watching the kind of story that would be talked about at country club luncheons for months. The eviction notice is real, I said, addressing my parents directly. James followed proper legal procedures and you've been officially removed from the property. However, I'm going to make you an offer. Dad straightened slightly, hope flickering in his eyes. I'll let you move back in, I continued. Same unit, same view, same building you've called home for 12 years. But there will be conditions. What conditions? Mom asked, her earlier arrogance completely gone. First, you'll pay rent like any other tenant. Market rate, on time, every month. No family discounts, no special treatment. Second, you'll treat my property management staff with respect. James Morrison is a Harvard MBA who manages an $85 million portfolio. He's not someone you ignore or talk down to. I paused, looking around the table at my family's faces. And third, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, you'll stop introducing me as the family disappointment. As I'm not renting, Mom. I'm the landlord. The room erupted in whispers and murmurs as the full impact of the evening's revelations sank in. Mrs. Hartford was staring at me with undisguised admiration. Other guests were pulling out their phones, probably looking up property records or trying to verify what they'd just heard. Dad stood up slowly, his face a mixture of shame and amazement. Sir, we had no idea. Why didn't you tell us? Because every time I tried to talk about my work, you cut me off or changed the subject, I replied honestly. When I bought my first duplex, you told me I was wasting my money. When I expanded to my second property, you said real estate was too risky for someone without experience. After a while, I stopped trying to share my successes with people who were determined to see me as a failure. Mom reached for my hand, her eyes bright with tears. Sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I had no idea what you'd accomplished. Can you ever forgive me? I looked around the ballroom at the 50 guests who had witnessed her public humiliation of me and my equally public vindication. Then I looked at my parents, flawed, proud, stubborn people who had loved me imperfectly but consistently. Of course I forgive you, I said, squeezing Mom's hand. But things are going to be different going forward. I'm not your disappointment and I'm not your little girl who needs guidance. I'm a successful businesswoman who happens to be your daughter. James called back as the evening was winding down, and I answered on speaker again, this time with my parents' permission. Ms. Williams, I've had the penthouse cleaned and prepared for new occupancy. Should I start showing it to prospective tenants tomorrow? I looked at my parents who were watching me with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Actually, James, hold off on listing it. The previous tenants are going to be applying for retenancy. Please send them the standard application and run their credit checks. If they qualify and agree to our terms, they can move back in next week. Very good, ma'am. I'll prepare the paperwork. After I ended the call, Dad cleared his throat. Sarah, about the back rent. Consider it a 30th anniversary gift, I said with a smile. But the slate starts clean from next month. Deal. Deal, Dad said, extending his hand for a formal handshake. And Sarah, I'm proud of you. More proud than I've ever been. As the evening ended and guests began to leave, I found myself surrounded by business cards and invitations. Mrs. Hartford wanted to discuss investment opportunities. 3 different men asked if I was looking for partners in new ventures. Amanda hugged me tightly and whispered that she'd always known I was destined for something special. But the moment that mattered most came when Mom pulled me aside as we were leaving. I was wrong tonight, she said quietly. You're not our disappointment. You're our surprise. And I think that might be even better. Walking out of the Windsor Hotel that night, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying the people who underestimated you. It's succeeding so completely that they have no choice but to see you clearly for the first time. The next morning, James called to tell me that my parents had submitted their rental application along with a heartfelt letter apologizing for their past behavior and requesting the opportunity to be model tenants. I approved their application immediately. After all, they were family. And now finally they knew exactly who I was.